Hi, statistics students. Welcome back. Another day, another opportunity to learn. Okay. Again, like you're probably figuring out, stats is going to be a lot different than your other math classes. A lot of words, but again, I promise you stick with it, stay patient. You will definitely find an appreciation for this course. Okay. We're going to keep working today on some more statistics terminology, and today's going to be a little bit of a heavier day. Take a deep breath. Remember, stop, pause when you need to when you're watching the video. Kind of do what you need to do. And if you're watching and questions pop up, make sure you write them down so you can come to your teacher and ask them questions about it. Okay. Awesome. Now, one thing you'll notice about me, I do like if I'm in class with you, I like to kind of help you set up your notebook in an organized fashion. So the learning target or the goal up top. And then I usually like to break it up like a 1/4 or 1/3, 2/3, where if there's terms, I put them on the side. So then when you're studying, you can like cover things up almost like a flashcard. Or if there's steps to a problem, I'll put the steps over on one side and then I'll do the problem on the other. You don't have to do that while you're at home. It's just kind of a friendly tip. And some of you have had me in class, you know that I like to do that as well. Okay, let's get going. So I can distinguish between a population and a sample, as well as an observational study and an experiment. Let's go through the definitions. I'll go through them a little quick, pause when you need to, and then we'll go to some problems and put it in practice. So observational study. An observational study is basically we want to get data, right? How are we going to get data? And one way we could get data to analyze that data so we can draw conclusions about a population is through an observational study. And that is something that observes and measures variables, but does not attempt to influence the response. And a phrase I'd like to say is observe, don't disturb. Observe, don't disturb. Okay. So what's our issue? We want to get data. We want to draw conclusions about a population. So how are we going to get that data? We're going to execute an observational study. All right, let's move on to the next term. A comparative observational study, comparing the same variable but different time frames. So one thing a teacher might want to do if they're teaching two statistics class, they might want to give their fourth hour an observational study. And I might do that if it was me, I might do it through something called a sample survey, right? And then I could give my fifth hour stats class an observational study through a sample survey and see what they thought about statistics, and did time of day have anything to do with how they're feeling? Or did I maybe teach it one way for fourth hour and a different way for fifth hour, right? And in comparing test scores, or in comparing their thoughts on my teaching style, or whatever may be, okay? So I'm comparing the same variable. So that would be, if I want to see how well they learned, I could look at their grades on a test, right? Okay, I'm going to compare fourth hour to fifth hour. So comparing the same variable, but different time frames. Your gym teacher might want to know how was first hour doing compared to seventh hour. So they record your mile time and they say, okay, first hour, right? First hour, well, they're maybe more awake and they were faster than seventh hour. They're recording your mile time, same variable, but different time frames, okay? One other comparative observational study can sometimes be with like a sleep product, melatonin. They want to see the effect of melatonin. So they ask you to record how long you're sleeping, okay, before you start taking the melatonin. And then you take the melatonin, and then afterwards, okay, then they say, are you sleeping better? And they record how long you're sleeping without interruptions, okay? Or a weight loss program. You do before, after, and you see was there any weight lost, okay? Things like that, they're measuring your weight. All right, comparative observational study. Talked a little quick there, so hopefully you got through it okay. All right, the next thing is a sample survey, and I talked about that already, is a easy way to obtain data for observational studies, okay? An easy way to obtain data for observational studies. And I'm sure lots of you have already taken a sample survey in your life. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about Mrs. Opal, or so on and so forth, okay? So there's lots of sample surveys I'm certain you have taken in your life. Population, okay, so the population and the sample. I'm gonna kind of look at this. I'm gonna talk about both of these at the same time, okay? What's gonna happen is you're gonna have, hold on here. You're going to be asked to read through a problem, and you're going to be asked to determine what is the population in this problem and what is the sample, okay? And it's really important that you can distinguish between the two, because eventually we're going to talk about something called a statistic and a parameter. And it's really important that you understand what those are as well. And a statistic and a parameter In order to figure out what those are, you need to know what the population is and the sample, because a statistic and a parameter are tied to the population and the sample. So you have to know the difference between the two. So here's the scenario, okay? We want to draw conclusions about a population, right? We want to draw conclusions about Armstrong students and see how well distance learning is going, okay? Well, we might not have the means to ask everyone, okay? So instead we figure out who can we get a hold of, and we find a sample. And we want to make sure that that sample is a randomized sample, okay? Because we want that sample to represent the population. So we find 1,000 people in the Robbinsdale School District, okay? And we ask them questions, okay, about how they're feeling about distance learning or so on and so forth, or the new school start time. Sometimes they've talked about that, right? So we get that sample and we get all the data and we analyze that data. And then what we do with that data is we use that data from the sample to draw conclusions about the whole population, okay? So we use the data from a sample to draw conclusions about the population. Another quick story I like to say just when we're talking about a sample and a population, if you've ever been to a place called Costco, a lot of times there's samples there, not anymore during COVID, but usually pre-COVID, there would be someone there scanning with their sample, right? And you take a bite of a sample of a cookie or whatever it may be, and you think, oh my goodness, those cookies are really good. What you just did is you drew conclusions from a sample about an entire population, all of the cookies, and you decide, I'm gonna go buy some cookies, okay? So that sample helps you draw a conclusion about that population. All right, enough said. Let me help you get down the definition. A population is an entire group of individuals about which we want to draw conclusions about, or we want information. Now I have a little side note here. And oftentimes when you are doing your learning checks or your practice problems or an assessment, it's sometimes easier to figure out what the sample is before the population. So I just wrote that here. When describing a population, find the sample and replace the number with the word all. I'm going to practice that with you right now here in a second. But first, why don't you just write it down? So that will be in your practice problem. Okay, so what is the sample then? The part of the population from which we collect the information. We then draw / predict or approximate conclusions about the population based off the sample. And I've already talked a lot about that. So you can see the whole population there. We take a random sample that represents the whole population, okay? And then we draw conclusions about that population. All right, I'm going to move on to a census. Again, just keep in mind to be pausing when you need to be writing things down. What is a census? A sample survey that attempts to include the entire population. Now, normally statisticians only do a census if they have a small population. For example, if I want to know how statistics is going for you guys, I'm not going to sample 10 people. I'm going to sample all 40 of my students or all 80 of my students. That's easy for me to do. I don't need a sample to draw conclusions about my entire class, okay? So oftentimes a census, we use that with a small population. Now, every 10 years, like we are doing this year, the government attempts to do a census, right? They attempt to get a hold of every single person who lives in the United States so they can draw conclusions about our population, and then they make decisions based off of those census results, okay? So that does happen every 10 years. And it only happens every 10 years for various reasons, but one of them, it's very time consuming. We have a large population in the United States, okay? So that's why it really is more beneficial to do a census for a small sample. You wouldn't just, a small population. You wouldn't just take a sample if you had a small population. You would just sample everyone, okay? Experiments, okay? So we've talked about an observational study. Now we're going to talk about an experiment. An experiment is another way that we can get data, okay? And how we get that data is we want to do an experiment. What is an experiment? An experiment is where we impose a treatment on different sets of groups to test a hypothesis, okay? We might think that Advil actually does a better job with headaches than Tylenol. So we're going to impose a treatment on them. We're going to take people who suffer headaches. We're going to break them up into two groups. And we're going to say, you guys take Tylenol and you guys take Advil. Okay, whenever you have a headache, we're going to check back in a month And we're going to analyze how your headaches were based off of those 2 treatments, okay? So imposing a treatment. Now, a treatment doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a drug. It could be, think about, we have a group of stressed out teenagers and they want to go through a stress management clinic, okay, to see what treatment might be better for stress. So we could take this group of teenagers and we could break them up into 3 groups. One group, they could be taught meditation. Another group, they're being taught yoga. And another group is being taught the right ways to exercise, okay? And we follow them for a month and then we join back together and we analyze our results, whatever we're looking for, okay? Again, we imposed a treatment on them. That is an experiment. All right, we're at the 10-minute mark. I do want to go through 2 problems with you to help you for today, but I would suggest just taking a quick little break, pausing, stand, stretch, and then come back. We probably have about 10 more minutes left. You guys are doing great. Keep hanging in there, stay patient, and we'll get there. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through these with you, and you guys are home, so I'm not, patrolling this to see if you're doing it or not. I would definitely write down those definitions. But if you want to just listen while I'm doing the examples for strategies, that might be a way too as well. Okay, so here's something that you might see on an assessment or on practice problems, so on and so forth. A publisher is interested in determining the reading difficulty of mathematics textbooks. Reading difficulty is determined by the length of sentences and the length of words used in the text. Researchers randomly select 10 paragraphs out of the most popular Algebra 1 textbooks and calculate the average sentence length and the average word length for that type of mathematics textbook. Identify the population and sample. Is this an observational study or an experiment? Okay, let's start with that population and the sample. So in my experience teaching statistics, people struggle with this identifying the population. So I always like to first, step 1, right? Let me just change my font here. First, I like to start with the sample, okay? And the sample, in my opinion, is a little bit easier because you're going to normally see a number attached to that. So when you're reading through this, the number I see is 10, right? The researcher randomly selects 10 paragraphs out of the most popular Algebra 1 textbooks, okay? So our sample in this case is 10 paragraphs out of the most popular Algebra 1 textbooks, okay? So what is the population then? Well, you could just say the population would be all of the words in the textbooks, but sometimes people don't necessarily, they struggle with that. They look at me and they're like, Miss Global, I don't know. So one helpful hint that I've told people to do is just take what you got from the sample, right? And then take the 10 off. So erase the 10 in your notebook and put the word all there, okay? The population then is all paragraphs of the most popular Algebra 1 textbook, okay? Now, if you wanted just to put all the text in the textbook or something else, that's fine. I'm just letting you know that because sometimes people struggle. So what should you have learned there? Start with the sample, okay? Then take the number off there and replace it with the word all, okay? Is this an observational study or an experiment? Okay, so now what we need to think is, it's, in my opinion, it's easier to start with is it an experiment, because an experiment has to have a treatment imposed. Something has to be changing about those individuals. So what are we doing? We're looking at textbooks. Are we changing anything? Are we imposing a treatment on them? No, no treatment is imposed, and that's why it's an observational study. Okay, what should we have learned? Observational study or experiment, start with the experiment, okay? Say, was a treatment imposed? And if it wasn't, then we know it's an observational study. Okay, let's move on to the next example. And again, I don't expect you to necessarily be writing these down. It's just to help you put this in context. A researcher is testing the effect of new fertilizer on crop growth. He marks 30 plots in a field, splits the plots in half, and randomly assigns the new fertilizer to one half of the plot and the old fertilizer to the other half. After 4 weeks, he measures the crop yield and compares the effects of the two fertilizers. Identify the population in the sample. Is this an observational study or an experiment? Again, step 1, start with that sample. What is that sample? I think it's helpful. Find a number with it, okay? Okay, so Our research, whereas there's a number right here, 30 plots in a field, but there's also 4 weeks. Well, 4 weeks is a time frame, and we're not we're not studying a time frame. The 4 weeks is how long this study is going on for, okay? So the sample is 30 plots in a field, okay? Which means the population, take the 30 off, put the word all plots in a field, okay? And then is this an observational study or an experiment? Now a treatment is being imposed. They're being broken up into 2 groups, and one group gets the new fertilizer and the other one gets the old fertilizer. Those are treatments that they're getting, and at the end they're looking at a result. So that means this is an experiment because a treatment was imposed. All right, you guys, I am done for the day. You're going to reconvene with the group and we'll talk about, make sure that you really were understanding the whole thing. Have an awesome day and we will chat soon.